What if one decision could change the destinies of countries? What if that birthright exchange between two brothers was more than just a family dispute? What if it was a significant pivot in human history? This is the tale of Esau and Jacob, brothers engaged in a rivalry so profound that it determined not only their own personal fortunes, but the fate of entire civilizations. There are many of themselves: merchants, kings, fathers, soldiers, adventurers. Yet they are all the same. Their lives may have taken place thousands of years ago, but their legacies are still woven into the fabric of the modern world. But why? What is the importance of this incredible story of Esau and Jacob? Was this a simple family dispute, or was it something much bigger? Was Esau really a victim of his brother's cunning, or was Jacob just executing a divine plan? And perhaps most important of all, does the duel between these two brothers continue to matter today? To understand the full weight of their story, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment their rivalry was set into motion. Because this was no ordinary brotherly rivalry. It was a fight for power, for identity, and for something much more mysterious: the very favor of God Himself. So I only briefly mention the story of Esau and Jacob because, on the face of it, two brothers growing up in a biblical household, this tale probably sounds quite simple. But as we peel away at their struggle, we can see that it wasn't just about two people. It was a battle that would set the stage for the destinies of two great nations, Israel and Edom. Esau, the firstborn, strong, outdoorsy by nature, and a hunter. He embodied physical prowess, survival, and the order of nature. Jacob, by contrast, was more pensive, more tactical, and, in some readings, more spiritually attuned. From the moment they were born, it was clear the tension between them. Jacob came out of his mother's womb holding Esau's heel, as if to yank his brother back so he could be born first. It was a symbolic gesture, a harbinger of the struggle that would define their lives. But was this rivalry just a battle of personalities? Or were there larger forces at work? Something divine? One prophecy, long before Esau and Jacob had been born, had already predetermined the outcome. Their mom, Rebekah, had a distressing contending within her womb while she was pregnant. Even before they drew their first breath, the unborn brothers appeared to be at war. Perturbed by this, Rebekah looked for answers, and what she was given was a prophecy from God. "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger." This was not simply a prophecy. It was a proclamation that upended the whole idea of birthright and inheritance. Birthright, double portion of inheritance, and leadership of the family was always given to the firstborn son. But here, the divine plan had previously decreed that the younger son would triumph over the older. The question is, was this prophetic warning or command? Did Rebekah and Jacob do the will of God, or did they conspire to ensure it happened? You may be wondering at this juncture, why does this story matter today? It is because the Hebrew nation descended from these two brothers would become two great nations. Jacob would become the Israelites, God's chosen people, and Esau's descendants would become the Edomites, who were often Israel's enemies. Their feud would send ripples through centuries, impacting history, politics, and even religious thought. But the reverberations of this rivalry are hardly confined to ancient texts. They persist in the struggles we witness to this day. The story's themes, brother versus brother, power struggles, deception, and destiny, are universal. They play out in our personal lives, in our societies, in world conflicts. Who gets to rule? Who is chosen? Who has the rightful inheritance? These are questions that have defined human civilization for millennia. So the struggle that started in Rebekah's womb didn't end with Esau and Jacob. To this day, in many ways, it continues. It is a forbidden mystery worthy of unraveling. However, there is much more to this story than appears on the surface. Esau and Jacob have been the subject of much debate. Esau is portrayed by some as the ill-fated older brother, the man who has been robbed of his right inheritance. Some view Jacob as the chosen one, fulfilling a God-given destiny, predestined to be. Who was truly in the right? How careless Esau was, throwing away his birthright for a simple bowl of food. Or was Jacob just an instrument of divine providence who ensured that God's will was fulfilled? These are the questions we will consider as we piece together the entire narrative of Esau and Jacob, the story that was hidden throughout history, the riddling genesis of nations. Now, before we get into the next point, if you are enjoying this deep dive into the biblical timeline, do us a favor, support this research and subscribe to the Bible Says channel by super thanksing us and help us for more powerful moments and hidden message from the scriptures. Now let us return to the point at which the War of Brothers began. Rebekah wanted children her entire life, but she had a long road to motherhood. For years, she remained childless, watching as people around her reveled in the joys of parenthood, while she and her husband Isaac waited for a divine blessing. When the moment finally arrived and she was able to conceive, her heart swelled with gratitude. But that euphoria was quickly eclipsed when she had an unexpected, distressing realization. This pregnancy was different, though. The creature growing inside her was restless, even violent. It felt like there had already been war inside her womb, a fight she could not parse. Day and night she was aware of the upheaval inside, a race war between the two children she bore. Never before had any mother undergone such a troubling experience. Almost as if the sons she had not yet birthed were already battling one another for supremacy of life before their first breaths even had a chance to be taken. She prayed to God for help, for wisdom and understanding. And then a prophecy came. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. These words were not just a prophecy. They were a divine declaration of war. From the start, these 2 boys were not just brothers. They were intended to become leaders of 2 warring nations, doomed to vie against each other into eternity. The prophecy obliterated all conventional notions of inheritance and power. The firstborn son was to inherit the family's blessings and responsibilities that stood to reason in a natural order. But here, before they were even born, God had long since chosen the younger to rule over the elder. And soon it was that the day of Rebekah's delivery came to pass. For Rebekah was ready with this truth close to her heart. When it did finally come, the moment of their birth bore a strange and symbolic omen of what was to come. The firstborn had come out, a lad with a thick coat of tawny red fur, with a rough-hewn face and rugged and ruffian features, as though he were molded from the wild and the dirt of the world. His parents named him Esau, but as the midwife lifted him, a second hand suddenly showed up, a small, grasping fist holding on to Esau's heel as if refusing to loosen its grip. The second child, closer on the heels, steady of grip, authoritative of stance. They called him Jacob, which means heel catcher or supplanter. From the instant they emerged from the womb, it was evident that these 2 brothers were intertwined by something much stronger than mere sibling rivalry. They weren't simply 2 people born of the same blood. They were embodiments of 2 conflicting forces, set in motion long before either of them was born. As the boys grew, they became more and more different. Esau, the firstborn, represented strength, rawness, and unbridled basic instincts. But he was a hunter, a field man. He thrived on the wild. His father Isaac admired his rugged nature and favored him above all his children. In Esau, Isaac saw the shining heir, mighty, competent, and suitable to lead. Jacob, however, proved quite different. He was silent, observant, and ferociously intelligent. Unlike his brother, he neither craved the thrill of the hunt nor the call of the wild. Instead, he remained near his home, mastering the household ways, sharpening his brain rather than his spear. His mother, Rebekah, saw a special quality in him that others perhaps did not. Esau walked the world on his brute strength, but Jacob moved with cunning and cleverness through existence. He was one step ahead, knowing something Esau never did, that raw power alone is brute force and cunning, and the magpie is always wiser than the boar. As they got older, the tension between the two only deepened, but the true rupture came with the idea of the birthright. In their day, the birthright was more than the inheritance of wealth and land. It was a sacred trust, a divine commission. The firstborn son was to extend the family name, to become the leader, protector of his people, and above all, he was to inherit God's covenant blessing. This was not a mere question of material gain, but one of spiritual significance. Esau, though, didn't seem to understand the gravity of this obligation. The birthright was just one more thing to be a privileged older brother about, not something he particularly valued, and something he certainly didn't grasp. He was a man of the present, living in the moment, gratifying his immediate needs without much concern for the future. But Jacob recognized the birthright for what it really was, a means to power, a place of divine purpose that shouldn't be taken lightly. He knew that whoever controlled the birthright would not only inherit Isaac's wealth, but also occupy the center of God's promise. And thus, at a young age, he watched and waited, recognizing that one day his brother's unruly ways would give him a chance. Their conflict was not merely over who would inherit their father's wealth, it was about so much more. It was about destiny. It was about the completion of a heavenly blueprint that had been put into motion long before they even existed. And in the months and years that followed, the two worlds drifted further apart, until the day finally arrived. When Jacob could act, take advantage of a convergence pivotal to history, Esau had always moved in the present tense. His was a life governed almost entirely by instinct, by the thrill of the hunt, by the gratification of his immediate wants. The idea of long-term consequences never seemed to bother him. He lived as if the future was an afterthought, something to be concerned about when the moment arrived. This mindset is exactly how he ended up doing such a shocking thing as selling his birthright for a single bowl of lentil stew. The trade was so simple it was almost absurd. Esau came back from the fields, weary and hungry after hunting all day. His brother Jacob cooked a pot of stew, the smell wafting through the air. Esau was so hungry that reason and restraint were not particularly in his thoughts. When he demanded food, Jacob, ever the strategist, seized on an opportunity. "First sell me your birthright," Jacob said. It ought to have been a laughable request. The birthright was far more than an inheritance. It was the very nature of a man as head of his family and before God. It signified governance, heavenly, favor, and the flourishing of a holy covenant. But Esau treated it like a small deal. "Look, I'm about to die," he said. "What good is a birthright to me?" Yet an oath sealed his doom, a momentary pleasure for the destruction of his divine legacy. In spirit, and with more weight than the potatoes he traded in, the rape of Esau was complete, the birthright moving from the grasp of the elder hand to that of the younger, but Esau could only have understood the violence at the moment, and so there is no punishment for the loss. Jacob, though, had a good idea what it had just purchased. He knew how important this moment was in the spiritual scheme of things, even if his brother didn't. But there was one hitch. The birthright was one thing, the blessing was another. Their father, Isaac, was old, frail, and nearly blind. The time had aged him, and the day when he will die seemed not that far. Before a father died, he must have bestowed his final blessing on his firstborn son. Now this blessing was far bigger than just a spoken blessing. It was a prophetic release that had strength from above that wrote the destiny of the recipient. It was uttered and now it could not be undone. The patriarch Isaac intended to offer this blessing to Esau, not knowing the birthright had been given away. Their mother, Rebekah, had been listening. She knew what God had even declared before, her sons' births, that the older would serve the younger. To her, it was not a question of who should receive the blessing. She would not sit idle and let Esau take what is for Jacob. Was this just a mother's favoritism, or was it part of God's plan? Rebekah's decision was swift. She reached out to Jacob and explained her scheme. Isaac was about to bless Esau, but they would jump ahead of him. She told Jacob to dress up like Esau, to put on his brother's clothes, to cover Jacob's smooth flesh with goat's hair, so that he would feel as bristly and hairy as his older brother. The lies were meticulous, calculated, and Jacob, after a moment's hesitation, complied. Jacob walked into the chamber of his father with thick tension in the air. Isaac, so frail and blind, suspected he was being tricked. "Who are you, my son?" he asked. Jacob paused and steadied himself. "I am Esau, your firstborn," he replied. It sounded like a lot, but it had to work. Isaac hesitated. The voice belonged to Jacob, yet the odor, the texture, they belonged to Esau. He reached and touched the roughness of Jacob's disguised arms, inhaled the scent of Esau's clothing. Unease remained in his heart, but ended by accepting what his senses told him. And then, the moment came. Isaac raised his hands and said the words that would alter everything. "May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. You shall be lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. Cursed are those who curse you, and blessed are those who bless you." By those words, the blessing had been transferred. The covenant, the inheritance, the very future of a people. Jacob possessed it all. Just after Jacob had left, Esau came in. His voice was eager, his spirit free, prepared to receive what he always thought was rightfully his. "My father, rise up, eat of my game, that thou mayest bless me." Isaac froze. It hit him like a thunderclap. "Who are you?" Esau's heart pounded. "I'm your son, your firstborn Esau." Terror filled Isaac's eyes. He trembled violently. "Who was it then that hunted beast and brought it into my vicinity? I am blessed, and indeed he will be blessed." The words blew apart Esau's world. He gave a great, bitter cry, a kind of wail that is born of a soul that understands it has lost something that cannot be regained. "Bless me! Me too, my father!" he pleaded. But it was too late. The blessing was rendered and there was no going back. Isaac could give only a lesser blessing, one that foretold Esau's future struggles. Esau wasn't sad for long. He was furious. He had been bested, wrong-footed, robbed of his future. His brother had stolen everything from him, and now there was only one course of action: revenge. "The days of mourning for my father are close at hand," he whispered. "Then I will slay my brother Jacob." When Rebekah heard of Esau's plan, she realized Jacob's life was in danger. She'd helped him get the blessing. Now she had to bail him out from under it. There was only one option remaining. Jacob would have to get out, and it would have to be fast. Esau's rage was the like of which he'd never known before. And all his life he had been the better one. The provider, the man of the fields who feared nothing. And just like that, at a single moment, everything that was ahead had been taken from him. The birthright had long passed him by, but the blessing, that he had been sure was his. And now that was gone as well, taken by deceit, by trickery, by the very brother he had once shared a womb with. It seethed in his breast like an eternal flame of betrayal. The pain was unendurable, and his anguish swiftly became a thirst for revenge. His voice quavering with anger, he balled his hands into fists. "The days of mourning for my father are near, then will I slay my brother Jacob." It wasn't an empty threat. It was a vow, a promise to himself. Isaac was aged and feeble, and Esau would postpone until his father had left. But the days of mourning would soon be over, and he would go after Jacob like an animal. Rebekah, incipient stalker, learned of Esau's murderous plan. Fear gripped her heart. She had planned the deception, but she had not expected the full force of Esau's rage. She knew her sons well. Esau was not one to forgive and forget. Jacob's life would be at risk if he stayed. His only chance to escape was to run away. She hurried to Jacob, her voice urgent. "Your brother Esau is comforting himself by planning to kill you. My son, listen to me. Do not be afraid and escape to my brother Laban in Haran. So stay with him till your brother's fury cools." The Jacob who had once held the reins, who had schemed to get in front of his brother, was now at the mercy of uncontrollable events. He had gained everything, but in the process, he had lost the very thing he never imagined losing: his home. He could not stay. His father Isaac, still in shock from the deception, and confirmed the decision. He called Jacob and blessed him again knowingly. "Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan," he commanded. "Go at once to Paddan Aram, to the house of your mother's father Bethuel. Take a wife for yourself from among the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother." Then Isaac gave him yet another blessing, one affirming the covenant. "I am the El Shaddai. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations will come from you. May he bless you and your descendants with the blessing of Abraham." The irony was bitter. Jacob had risked everything to gain his father's blessing. And now, with his father fully aware, he was being sent away, not in triumph, but in exile. The road ahead was far, uncharted and perilous. Jacob had finally been alone, for real, in his life. No mother to lead him, no father to defend him, no brother to oppose him, only the wide, wild land stretching out before him. For days, he had been home concepting, reading, planning. No choice then but to become a wanderer. When night fell, Jacob was in a lonely, desolate place. Weary from his journey, he picked up a stone in place of a pillow and rested. But sleep did not bring relief. Instead, he received a vision that would change his life forever. He dreamed that there was a ladder between heaven and here, and that angels were going up and down. At the top was the Lord, and his voice pierced the stillness of the night. "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the way, God of Isaac. I am going to give you and your descendants the land where you are lying. Nežatanini zerjuzi dust kibir, kupus žilir, žir kujun, tin švina, birga ka enge I, uočmagan de čutunige berilar, že ine klasuklar, že 403. All the people on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you, and will protect you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until what I have promised you." Jacob sat bolty, upright, his heart racing. He had departed from his home with nothing but fear and uncertainty, but now he had something far exceeding that, a divine assurance. He was not abandoned. He was not lost. God had been watching him all the time. Overwhelmed, Jacob took the stone he had used as a pillow and stood it upright as a pillar. He anointed it with oil and called the place Bethel, or house of God. And then he made a vow. "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey, I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God." It no longer was a story of mere survival. It was a transformation. He had departed as a fraud, a man who had secured his brother's blessing through subterfuge. But now, he moved knowing he was chosen, being molded by something larger than himself. Esau's rage had sent him running, But in the meantime, Jacob was being refined. His exile was not a punishment, it was preparation. His journey wasn't just about fleeing death, it was about embracing destiny. Life in Laban's house was difficult for Jacob. He went out as a man who had tricked his own brother and now found himself the fool. Earlier, when he had first arrived at Laban's household, he had been smitten with Laban's younger daughter, Rachel. He was so taken with her beauty that he offered to be a servant for 7 years if that would earn him her hand in marriage. Years flew by. For Jacob, the hard work gone light with love, but the trickster was tricked on his wedding night. When the morning light shone on his bride, Jacob woke up to the bitter realization that he spent the night with Leah and not Rachel. Laban had tricked him, just as he had once tricked his own father. There was no ignoring the irony of this situation. He had been disguised to take his brother's blessing, and now, under the cover of night, he himself had been duped by a disguise. Anger smoldered within, but what could he do? So Laban, with his deviousness, had already cooked up an excuse. It is not the done thing in our country to marry off younger daughters before the older ones. In order to take Rachel as a wife, Jacob would have to work another 7 years. With no other option, Jacob said yes. 7 more years of work had gone by, and at last he had Rachel. But by then his household was no longer straightforward. As if he needed more challenges, now he had 2 wives. Shortly, their rivalry began. Rachel, his love, was barren. Leah, his unloved, bore him many sons. Their rivalry intensified, giving rise to jealousy, competition, and hostility. Even their servants got drawn into the conflict, each giving Jacob children in a bid for favor. His family expanded, but so did the tensions. Jacob was a wealthy man after years of labor and struggle. He was smarter than Laban with herds, making sure that no matter what Laban did to try to rip him off, he thrived. But deep down, Jacob knew Haran was not his home. He had worked for years at establishing a life in Laban's household, but his fate was destined for somewhere else. The promise that God gave him at Bethel was still echoing in his heart. It was time to return. Leaving Laban was not simple. Jacob knew Laban well and feared confrontation, but God came to him and commanded him to go back to his father's land. Taking his wives, children, and belongings, Jacob left by stealth. And when Laban chased after him, prepared for violence, God stepped in and instructed Laban in a dream not to hurt Jacob. What might have been a violent conclusion became an uneasy truce, and Jacob went on his way. As he approached Canaan, another fear loomed before him, the fear of his brother Esau. The last time he'd laid eyes on his brother, Esau had vowed to kill him. Had time blunted Esau's rage, or was Esau still waiting to keep his pledge? Jacob could not be sure. He dispatches messengers ahead with a gift in hopes of mollifying Esau's wrath before they come face to face. The news they returned with was terrifying. Esau was coming to meet him, and he had 400 men with him. Panic ensued. Jacob split his people into 2 camps, figuring that if Esau attacked one, the other might get away. But he realized no strategy could save him now. He was no longer just grappling with a brother, he was grappling with the weight of his past. And then something remarkable occurred that night. Jacob found himself at night, isolated and alone, when he met a man, a mysterious unknown, that he wrestled with vigorously and relentlessly. The two wrestled throughout the night, neither with an advantage. But this was no ordinary man. Just at daybreak, the stranger reached out and touched Jacob's hip, dislocating it with a touch. A jolt of pain shot through Jacob's body, but he would not let go. He held on to the man, understanding that this was not a man to be fought. Desperation filled his voice. "I will not let you go until you bless me." The man stared at him and said, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he replied, his breath making laborious sounds. Then came the moment that would seal his fate. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. This was something more than a name change. It was an identity makeover. Jacob, the trickster, the man who had conned his way through life, was now Israel, the man who fought with God and won. This was not a wrestling match. This was an act of submission, of endurance, of belief. Jacob limped away from the encounter, forever changed as the sun rose. His hip and thigh were rested, ensuring that he would walk with a limp, an everlasting memento of the night he had grappled with the divine. But it was his soul, more than his body, that had been transformed. The man he once was no more. It was no longer just that he took blessings by deception. Now he had fought for one, and been granted a new purpose. The next morning, Jacob lifted his eyes, and behold, Esau was coming. His heart pounded. Would his brother hold him, or would this be the end? Esau's offspring did not fade into obscurity, but instead built a mighty and feared kingdom, the Edomites. Unlike Jacob, who was a wanderer for most of his life, Esau set up shop quickly. He established himself in the rugged region of Seir, a mountainous area southeast of the Dead Sea. This is where his people thrived, developing into a dominant country that would heavily influence biblical history. The kingdom of Edom was not just an outgrowth of Esau's inheritance, it was a power that would contend with Israel for centuries. The Edomites were a people forged by their inhospitable environment. Seir was a rugged, mountainous region that would have posed serious challenges to the typical agrarian lifestyle, but they adapted and became skilled mountain people. Unlike the Israelites, who would later languish under Egyptian slavery, the Edomites carved out their own strength and autonomy. They took control of vital trade routes, including the famed King's Highway, which linked Africa to Mesopotamia. This gave them wealth and positioned them well amongst their regional powers. All this made the conflict between Edom and Israel unavoidable. With the post-exilic recasting of Genesis from personal rivalry between Esau and Jacob to the national rivalry that continued for centuries, the Edomites never forgot that Jacob had snatched up both the birthright and the blessing. While Esau had seemed at peace with his fate, his descendants felt the historical grievance. They considered themselves the rightful successors to Abraham's legacy, and their hostility toward Israel was about more than land. It was an extension of an ancient grudge. Hostility came during the time of the Israelites led by Moses, who wanted to pass through Edomite land to reach the promised land following their exodus from Egypt. Israel didn't want war. All they wanted was safe passage, but Edom refused, bringing out their army to prevent the Israelites from entering. This wasn't merely a political calculation, it was a symbolic gesture. Edom did not see Israel as brothers, but rather as rivals, and their response to Israel served as an unmistakable sign of that fact. It would be one thing if these two nations had never been able to locate a path toward reconciliation, but even if they managed to keep an active peaceful travel was met with resistance. This enmity played out century after century in warfare, betrayals, and shifting alliances. Once Israel in due time settled down to become a kingdom in Canaan, Edom posed a threat, as well as troubling in surrounding territory. There were times Edom rebelled, times Israel conquered them, and times Edom pounced on Israel in one of its low points. One of the most infamous betrayals occurred when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. But rather than assist their distant relatives, the Edomites gloat and celebrate. According to some accounts, they even helped loot the city, widening the gulf between the two nations. For this treachery, the things which the prophets of Israel have pronounced against Edom are grievous things. The book of Obadiah, the shortest but one of the most intense prophetic books, devotes its entire account to the downfall of Edom. The prophet Obadiah railed against Edom's pride and arrogance, prophesying that the mountains on which they placed their security would not be enough to shield them from God's judgment. "If you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down," the Lord said. And over time, this prophecy came to pass. Edom, however, started to fall off despite how strong it was. A tribe of Arabs, known as the Nabateans, encroached more and more on Edomite lands, finally taking over their cities and commercial avenues. By the Roman period, Edom as a nation had all but disappeared. The remaining Edomites were assimilated into surrounding cultures, and their identity as a distinct people disappeared. Yet Edom's influence never fully vanished. Indeed, one of its last great figures would take a key role in biblical history: Herod the Great. His Edomite descent got Herod the king of Judea at Jesus' birth. Despite ruling over the Jews, he was never fully accepted by them. He tried to win favor by building the Second Temple, but his reign was one of paranoia, cruelty, and treachery. He ordered the notorious massacre of the innocents, wanting to kill the infant Jesus to remove a possible rival. In many ways, Herod represented the last reverberations of Edom's battle, inextricably tied to Israel, yet belonging nowhere. Edom's tale is one of possession, competition, and eventual ruin. They established themselves as a powerful kingdom, opposed their brothers in Israel, and finally were condemned by God. Once they flourished, and their story is also a warning of how old feuds can help forge history. The prophecy came true, and they were destroyed, an example for mankind. Today, Edom is seen only in the pages of history books and holy scriptures. The mighty descendants of Esau, who swore to take their own path, had finally fallen. Jacob and Esau is one of history's most fundamental and permanent rivalries. It was never only about two brothers vying for their father's blessing. It was about two nations, two destinies, a conflict that the prophecy suggests could endure until the end of days. The reverberations of their struggle lie not only in the annals of ancient history, but they resonate in religious traditions, theological interpretations, and even the political milieu of the contemporary world. Is it possible that the tale of Jacob and Esau is still being played out before our eyes? So why does that matter for the end times? Right from the start, this conflict was God's doing. When Rebekah, the mother of Jacob and Esau, was pregnant, he struggled fiercely in her womb. Confused and distressed, she asked God for a sign, and he gave her one of immense power. "Tome of sons will be in your womb, and two peoples will be separated from your bowels. Blood will be stronger than blood, an elder will serve a younger." Genesis 25:23. This was not mere prediction. It was proclamation of war. God knew in advance that the progeny of these two brothers would be engaged in a conflict that would literally change the world. And this struggle would define not only ancient Israel and Edom, but also have lasting effects on the last days of mankind, according to biblical prophecy. Their rivalry symbolizes something much more: the struggle between the two great powers within the world in the Hebrew Scriptures. One of the most vehement prophecies against Esau's descendants, the Edomites, appears in the book of Obadiah. It predicts a day of divine judgment when Edom will be utterly destroyed for its violence against Jacob's descendants. This prophecy is frequently connected with the end of days, which would have the implication that the forces of Esau will eventually fall unto God's final judgment. Isaiah also speaks of the destruction of Edom, providing a heart-rending description of God's anger that is being kindled against the land. "For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion, and the streams of Edom shall be turned into pitch, and its soil into sulfur. Its land shall become burning pitch." Isaiah 34:8-9. Many Jewish scholars have understood Esau and Edom in such prophecies as more than just historical figures. In rabbinic literature, Esau's descendants came to represent Israel's greatest foes, especially the Roman Empire. Destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE by the Romans was seen as a continuation of Esau's hostility to Jacob's descendants. Over the centuries, a number of Jewish expositors have associated Esau with various world powers who have acted against Israel, indicating that the spirit of Esau is alive and well in certain ongoing historical, current manifestations. Esau and Jacob and their ultimate battle, in fact, runs through Christianity's veins. The Apostle Paul refers to Jacob and Esau as well in the New Testament, writing this in his letter to the Romans: Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Romans 9:13. This declaration has been the subject of much theological controversy, although most Christian theologians see this as representative of the general warfare between the chosen people of God and those who have declined the higher purpose of God. Some even interpret Esau as signifying the rebellious nations that will arise against God's people in the end times. According to the book of Revelation, which describes a climactic final battle, the forces of darkness will wage war against the sons of Jacob, a conflict which some might argue is the original eternal battle between Esau and Jacob. The story has an echo in Islamic traditions that might not be as directly alluded to Esau, but just as stridently given in Surah of the Quran. Uncle Edwards disagrees, pointing out that the sons are not so kind to each other. This marking a theme some Islamic scholars cite as a recurrent theme in the Quran that resonates with the story of Jacob and Esau, and the struggle of brothers vying for divine favor. Esau himself is not mentioned explicitly, but some interpretations hold that his offspring were involved in historical wars with the children of Israel. Some even suggest that traces of this age-old struggle are still evident in the political complications of the contemporary world. But what does all of this mean for today? Gospel today. Is there a dream, a vision, a battle today between Jacob and Esau? The majority of the world has historically been opposed to Israel, and some scholars have used that as an argument that, spiritually, they are in the footsteps of Esau. For others, the rivalry is a metaphor capturing the fight between righteousness and rebellion, between those who work in concert with God's will and those who do not. One of the most interesting things about this prophecy is the way it fits in with the wider picture of the end times. Most religious traditions describe an eventual battle between the forces of good and evil, and some scholars say that the fight between Jacob and Esau is the first of several possible blueprints for this final showdown. In Jewish eschatology, an ultimate defeat of Edom is an event leading to the Messianic era. Christian teaching maintains that in the end, all who stand against God's elect will be vanquished, and the notion of justice in the last days is central to Islamic eschatology, the study of how the world will end. It's still an open question. Are we witnessing the closing chapters of this ancient rivalry? For if the Jacob-Esau conflict is indeed manifest today, the latest developments in the Middle East and beyond are not simply political contests, but part of a grand, divinely mandated strategy. Its struggle has an effect, whether one takes it symbolically or literally. They have forged the past, they steer the now, and they might, according to prophecy, have a key part in the ultimate fate of humankind. The story of Jacob and Esau does not end with their personal reconciliation. Their struggle foreshadowed a grander cosmic drama, the one that plays out between the pages of ancient scripture and the events of the day. And should the prophecies prove accurate, their struggle is only just beginning. But Jacob never returned to his homeland. It was not only a physical return, it was a journey through the shadows of the past and a confrontation with the fears that haunted him for decades. He had departed as a young man, running for his life after fooling his brother Esau and stealing the blessing that belonged to the firstborn. Now, he was coming back as a husband, a father, and as a man who had grappled with both angels and fate. But even with his new transformation, there was one thing that hadn't changed: his fear of Esau's anger. As Jacob neared the site of Esau's present kingdom, their most recent meeting came rushing back to him, fresh and vivid. He remembered Esau's furious pledge to kill him, the storm in his brother's eyes when he discovered that his blessing had been stolen. That may have taken time, but what if that anger never died? What if Esau just waited for his revenge? These thoughts consumed Jacob, every step toward home feeling heavier than the one before. Aware of the peril that lay ahead, Jacob came up with a plan. He dispatched messengers in front of him to Esau, carefully instructing them what to say. "I have been staying with Laban, and now I am on my way. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goat, male and female servants. I am sending this message to my Lord, that I may find favor in your eyes." Genesis 32:4-5. But the answer he got sent a shiver through him. The messengers returned with the frightening news. "Esau is coming to meet you with 400 men." Genesis 32:6. Jacob's heart pounded. 400 men. This was not the reception of an understanding brother. This was an army. It seemed clear that Esau had not forgiven, that his anger had not subsided, and that Jacob's worst nightmares were getting ready to come to fruition. This was Jacob's desperate knee-jerk reaction. He split his camp in two, reasoning that if Esau attacked one side, the other might get away. Then, in a moment of utter surrender, he cried out to God and said, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, 'Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper.' I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. Save me, I ask, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children." Genesis 32:9-11. As he prayed, Jacob prepared a huge gift for Esau. Hundreds of goats, sheep, camels, cattle, and donkeys, all sent in separate waves to give the impression of an overwhelming tribute. It was a sign of peace, a last-ditch effort, to soften Esau's heart before he stood somberly in front of him. One night before the encounter, something unusual occurred. Jacob lay alone, struggling with a shadow figure until night turned to dawn. This wasn't an ordinary fight. It was a fight with the divine. The being, typically understood to be an angel or even an expression of God, injured Jacob, who, nonetheless, would not let go until he was blessed. He would from that moment be known as Israel, which means he struggles with God. This was a milestone. Jacob was no longer simply a trickster. He had fought and conquered in the corporeal and metaphysical realms. But this encounter did not change the reality of Esau's 400 men who were still looming before him. In the morning light, Jacob watched as Esau got close enough to be in the distance and flanked by an army legions capable of wiping out Jacob's entire camp. Jacob bowed to the ground 7 times as he approached Esau, the wives and children of this man trailing behind him in humility. And then something completely different happened. Instead of slaying Jacob, instead of unsheathing his sword, Esau ran to his brother, embraced him, and wept. Through years of avoidable anguish and countless ignited hatred, they stood there, locked in an embrace that put all of that aside in a moment of pure sentiment. Jacob broke down and introduced such members of his family as he had, and Esau did not respond with resentment but said, "What do you mean by all these flocks and herds which I met?" Jacob argued they were gifts, saying, "To find favor in your eyes, my lord." But Esau said, "I have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Genesis 33:8-9. This response baffled Jacob. Had Esau truly forgiven him? To be sure, was this a true act of reconciliation or just a truce to avoid bloodying the battlefields any further? Jacob, however, although he witnessed his brother's goodness, did not let down his guard. Esau offered to go with him on the journey, but Jacob politely refused, saying his children and flocks were slow and that he would proceed at his own speed. Esau then offered to leave some of his men with Jacob for protection. But once again, Jacob declined. Instead of going to Seir, where Esau, Jacob took a different direction, settling in Succoth and later in Shechem. This begs the very question: if Jacob was convinced Esau had forgiven him, why didn't he join him? Some argue that Jacob's behavior reflects a lack of belief in Esau's forgiveness from the outset. Maybe he was worried that the gush of emotions would fade, that the old anger would return when the moment of sentimentality had ended. Others argue that Jacob knew their fates would not bind them together, that whatever love they might share as brothers, their nations were always going to be enemies. Ultimately, Jacob and Esau's reunion was one of power, emotion, and surprise. It was a moment where history could have been changed, where two brothers could have really united. But whether that was an end to the feud, or simply a temporary peace, would remain a mystery, one that would influence the trajectory of history for decades to come. Jacob and Esau are the original brothers of the Old Testament, and their story has been told and retold for thousands of years. Burrowed in biblical narratives are hidden messages, ancient interpretations, and lost texts that tell the deeper story behind their rivalry. Their story is embellished by many religious and historical sources, adding layers of meaning that suggest a much larger cosmic struggle. But among the most fascinating of these outside sources is the massive cache of ancient documents collectively referred to as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Found in the mid-20th century close to the Dead Sea, these scrolls include writings that provide insight into several biblical characters, such as Jacob and Esau. Others, particularly drawing from the literary interpretation of the biblical text, have suggested that the conflict was not simply personal, but rather part of a divine struggle between good and evil. Other interpretations, however, especially from the Qumran community, the group believed to have housed and preserved these scrolls, view Esau and his progeny, the Edomites, as embodying a sort of rebellion against divinely sanctioned order, while Jacob and the people from which he sprang stood as those whom God has chosen to accomplish God's purposes. Midrashic literature, the ancient commentary texts of Judaism, also dives into the rich and nuanced meanings of Jacob and Esau's rivalry. The Midrashim use allegory and symbolism to interpret the Torah and refers to Esau as the eternal enemy of Israel in many of these writings. Some interpretations even connect Esau's bloodline to a description of the later Roman Empire, saying, "The Jacob-Esau struggle lived on long after their corpses did, as the continued political and spiritual struggles of Israel and Rome." This view would have been especially pertinent during the period of the destruction of the Second Temple, in 70 CE, when Rome vanquished Jerusalem and the Jewish people were exiled. Related to this, one midrash I found especially revealing says, when Rebekah asks God why she feels the struggle in her womb, she is shown the future. Not only will the two nations fight in their lifetimes, but their heirs will continue to have contention between them through all generations. This view means that the account of Jacob and Esau is about more than sibling rivalry. It is a prophecy about the destiny of nations. Another interesting layer of interpretation regarding Jacob comes from Christian traditions, which often interpret Jacob and Esau's story as a foreshadowing of something much deeper theologically. Other early Christian writers, like St. Augustine, viewed Esau as the representative of the earthly man, lusting after the flesh, while Jacob was prototype of the spiritual man, called by God for something above what is earthly. It's a duality that reflects a wider Christian theme of spirit versus flesh, divine election versus human impulse. Unlike the Bible, the Quran does not explicitly name either Jacob or Esau, but according to some interpretations by Islamic scholars, there are references to their story that can also be found in Islamic sources. Some tafsir, interpretative commentaries, mention this as two nations, deriving from a common ancestor who struggle together and foreshadow subsequent tensions in world history between different peoples. While Islam primarily discusses Jacob, As a prophet, Esau is sometimes considered a model of those who abandon divine guidance for materialism. Outside of religious texts, historical records also suggest that the legacy of Jacob and Esau has endured. The Edomites were Esau's descendants, and they make many appearances in the biblical record, usually as enemies of the Israelites. The conflict did not cease even after Israel was established as a kingdom. Edom was ultimately defeated by Nebuchadnezzar after 586, absorbed into the Babylonian Empire, and had its namesake place names and culture erased, although this was a practice later revived by Roman conquerors. But the echoes of their animosity were heard long after the ancient Edomites disappeared as a tribe. Some historians trace the feud between the descendants of these two brothers to later political and ideological battles between different nations and empires. From a much deeper spiritual perspective, the story is about the notion that Jacob and Esau represent the two opposing forces within humanity itself. Jacob, the more solitary, reflective figure who dwelt in tents, represents spiritual development, endurance, and a divine plan. Esau, the man of the field, epitomizes the primal, unbridled forces within a human, the craving for instant gratification, the hunger for control, and worldly supremacy. The struggle of the higher self versus the lower self, with discipline versus indulgence, divine will versus human will, is a theme that resonates throughout many philosophical and religious teachings throughout history. Even the reconciliation scene between Jacob and Esau, which seems like an act of forgiveness, hides messages within it. Some Jewish mystics, especially in the Kabbalistic tradition, see their embrace as a universe in a state of cosmic tension. They propose that although Esau seemingly reconciled with Jacob, their inner spiritual war was just beginning. Some interpretations go even further, arguing that Esau's descendants would oppose Jacob's descendants throughout time, shaping all historical events that follow as the two sides long remain locked in battle. Lost scriptures and buried commentaries yield an astonishing expansion of this drama at the wilderness frontier, replete with deepening significance, far outstripping a mere sibling spat. And whether viewed as a historical quarrel, religious allegory, or prophecy of things to come, the story of these two brothers has continued to enthrall scholars, theologians, and historians alike. You are students of history, of ancient traditions, of sacred scriptures, the very nature of their struggle from the perspective of an individual conflict as contrasted to that of a more divine foundation that ultimately plays out in the ongoing flow of generations. Jacob and Esau are not merely two brothers tussling for top spot. Their story has influenced religious thinking, informed historical conflict, and, in a way, foreshadowed modern attitudes toward identity and fate. Their rivalry, reconciliation, and the prophetic weight given to their story have reverberated through history, shaping Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions in powerful ways. Their successors are still blessed in that to this day their legacy is somewhat present in cultural and geopolitical conflicts seen from the grand scale, as well as the spiritual battles that are fought in the hearts and souls of each individual. In Jewish tradition, the narrative of Jacob and Esau is inextricably linked to the identity of the Jewish people. Jacob, later called Israel, is considered the forefather of the Israelite people, as Esau is perceived to have served all those countries who persecuted or tortured the Israelites. Throughout their history, Jews have understood Esau and his descendants, the Edomites, as representing different empires that ruled or persecuted Jews, and this included the Romans. Several ancient Jewish texts indicate that the battle between Jacob and Esau was more than a mere sibling rivalry, but prophecy about future conflicts between Israel and world metropolises. Rabbinic commentaries even interpret Esau not simply as a historical personage, but as a continuing spiritual force, one whose antithesis challenges the faith and destiny of the Jewish people. In Christian thinking, Jacob and Esau's story is more commonly interpreted another way. In his letters, The Apostle Paul uses their story to illustrate the doctrine of divine election, that God chooses individuals for his work, apart from their works, according to his sovereign purposes. The New Testament reflects certain theological concepts developed out of Jacob's story and life, Paul's writings teaching that this selection occurred even before birth, God's efforts being beyond human understanding. Some Christian theologians also interpret Esau as a type of those who prioritize physical pleasure over spiritual promise, while Jacob represents those who pursue a spiritual and godly inheritance, even if it requires strenuous effort to acquire. It has been a contrasting dichotomy that has been used to demonstrate loving faith, patience, and waiting on the Lord versus raw physical strength, immediate gratification, and so on and so forth. Jacob, is another prophet in Islam, and the story of Esau is also mentioned by Islamic scholars based on history and biblical references, although Esau is not explicitly mentioned in the Quran. Certain Islamic traditions take the tussle between Jacob and Esau as a lesson of divine decree. What's meant for a person will come to them no matter how much it seems otherwise. In the Islamic tradition, Jacob is an exemplar of piety, patience, and perseverance, and an example to those who have faith in God's plan. The overarching theme of sibling rivalry and divine election emerges as a repeated theme throughout Quranic narratives, conveying the message that God's message and plans align with the ultimate wisdom. The story of Jacob and Esau has also played a significant role in historical, geopolitical conflicts. This is beyond even theological implications. This is an ancient tale, and many have recently drawn parallels between the bloody row between these two brothers and the current conflict between nations, with many still living records to avenge and much ethnic and religious history to exorcise. That same idea of two opposing forces pitted against each other to clash through eternity has been used to justify conflicts between peoples and groups that have hated each other for centuries. Others claim that the two-state struggle for domination can be actually applied to the great world powers that have emerged and waned in history, with all occasionally dominating and being dominated. Today, we see the legacy of Jacob and Esau in the form of ideological and geopolitical conflicts. It would be too simplistic to read global struggles as mere reflections of this ancient story, but the themes of rivalry, competition, and divine destiny certainly continue to shape how people understand today's history and events. The concept of a chosen nation stands in contrast to an adversary, a situation we see used in theological or political rhetoric, which at times may divide people but also serves as a reminder that human relationships are complex and that the choices we make out of passion or desperation have consequences. The message on a personal level from the story of Jacob and Esau is timeless. It's about the struggles of identity, ambition, and destiny. Jacob's perseverance is something people can identify with. The sense of pushing for something bigger despite starting out with the odds against them. Others can identify with Esau, the frustration of feeling passed over, the bitterness of regrets, and the willingness to swap something valuable for a short-term satisfaction. The narrative gives prompts to individuals to question themselves. What is valuable? How much are we preparing to give up? And how do our decisions impact the future, not only for us, but also for future generations? The deeper meaning of their reconciliation also sheds light on the human experience. Despite a bitter rivalry and separation, Jacob and Esau eventually crossed paths again, resulting in an unanticipated moment of forgiveness. Yet their reconciliation was fraught. Jacob still intentionally went his own way afterward, even as if he felt, as they embraced, that despite their reconciliation, they were still fated to different fates. This moment reminds us that reconciliation doesn't always mean going back to the way things were. In conclusion, the tale of Jacob and Esau remains relevant for the fact it addresses universal themes of struggling, redemption, and destiny. Be they religious or historical, or viewed through a personal lens, Their legacy reminds us that life is a series of choices, conflicts, and reconciliations. Their story isn't just about two brothers. It's about all of humanity and the ceaseless quest for purpose, justice, and divine favor. From Genesis, the story of Jacob and Esau is not just a story of two brothers. It is a story that has established nations, shaped religious beliefs as well as political understanding, and has been a rich source of philosophical and spiritual insight. From their infancy, even struggling in the womb, through a life of rivalry, deception, blessings, and destiny, they fought and made up. The ultimate question still endures: was their rivalry preordained, a divine plan that had to be, or a series of human choices informed by flaws, emotions, and ambition? The prophecy spoken to Rebekah before they were born said, "Two nations are in your womb. Two peoples shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." These words signal a battle that will last a lifetime. But did this prophecy predestine Esau to failure? Was Jacob predetermined to become the chosen one no matter what he did? Or did human decisions, Esau's indifference toward his birthright, Jacob's trickery, Isaac and Rebekah's favoritism, somehow influence the making of this conflict? Esau's demise is usually blamed on himself. Esau giving up his birthright for a bowl of lentil stew may seem foolish, but to him at the time it was a hunger-driven, impulsive decision. He prioritized instant gratification over eventual benefits, a misstep many continue to make with respect to different areas of life. On the other hand, Jacob, despite being chosen, struggled to arrive at his destiny. He misled his father, ran for his life, toiled under Laban's pawing, then wrestled with an angel to get his real blessing. He was and genius, and his life was not without hardship, indicative that God does not give us the gift of favor without a little trial, and yet still their fates remained intertwined even as their paths diverged. Esau was the father of the strong nation of Edom, and Jacob was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. The friction between their heirs continued on for generations, reflected in historical wars and religious iconography. The Edomites fought all the time with the Israelites, and later interpretations of their legacy also suffered, and Esau becomes the symbol of opposition to the divine will, while Jacob is the hero who eventually believes in his special destiny. But was Esau truly condemned? From some interpretations of the story, we learn that his rejection was not understood as him being cursed by God, as mentioned in the verses, but in fact, it came down to his decision on how to live his life. Cursed by Isaac with no time to modify his behavior, he never truly appreciated what Isaac had offered him as a blessing. That was too late. But in the moment of their reunion, Esau offered unexpected grace. Rather than avenge, he embraced Jacob and showed that maybe he'd found his peace outside the battle for land and blessing. The story they tell reflects human nature. How many times are we still like Esau, making rash decisions, trading something very precious for something we can have for the moment? How many times do we take the path of Jacob and aim for something higher than or outside of ourselves, trying to get whatever it takes only to realize this path is infinitely more challenging than we imagined? The story of these two brothers is not only their story, it is our story. Saint Michael would defeat them, and his victory would in turn inspire his everlasting struggle against Satan, which the Catholic Church has depicted as a battle for souls in families and nations, and even within ourselves. Their story has lasted over time and continues to mold religious and historical perspectives. Jacob, in Jewish tradition, becomes the father of God's chosen people, while Esau and his descendants represent a rivaling faction. In Christian theology, their struggle serves as an archetype of divine election and the stakes of placing temporal desire before the stakes of spiritual inheritance. Jacob is considered a prophet in Islamic thought, and Esau's narrative is primarily associated with history or biblical references, with a strong emphasis on fate and divine wisdom. Even outside of religion, their story is philosophical. It asks big questions about fate versus free will. Would history have been different if Esau had placed a different value on his birthright? Would Jacob have been chosen if he had not cheated his father? Or were all of these things leading up to an inescapable destination? It's the kind of questions that makes their story so gripping, because they are universal to every human conflict. Eventually, there is not a simple ending to their story. Though they patched things up, they didn't stop going their own ways. They never really acted like brothers again, but their legacies remained intertwined over the centuries. There we are reminded that reconciliation does not mean returning to the way things were. Sometimes peace is leaving loud, different people in different places. The real forbidden truth of their rivalry is that it's not just their story, it's humanity's story. It is a story of choices and battles, fate and salvation. It is between ambition and humility, between what is immediate and what is lasting, between being chosen by the divine and what we do on our own. And maybe all of us have a Jacob part and an Esau part in our souls, eternally wrestling for the dominant position. Now it's your turn to hear from us. What do you think? Was Esau done wrong, or was his destruction vengeful justice? Was Jacob really righteous, or were his means so flawed that they made him flawed too? And most important, do we hear echoes of their struggle in our own lives? Let me know what you thought in the comments, and if you enjoyed diving deep into the mysteries of Jacob and Esau, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit me with a super thanks to support more videos like this.